The most dangerous thing in war isn't the enemy's gun. It's the machine that fails when you need it most. November 1943, Tunisia. The North African sun beat down on a landscape that had seen too much death. Dust hung in the air like a shroud, turning every breath into sandpaper against the throat. The smell was always the same out here: burned oil cordite and something else. Something organic that men learned not to think about. Sherman tank number 30471 sat at a 40-degree angle on a rocky slope, smoke pouring from its engine compartment. Not the black smoke of fire, white smoke, the kind that meant something internal had given up, had decided it couldn't take one more mile, one more hill, one more day of being pushed beyond what its designers in Detroit had ever imagined. The crew was already out, 5 men who had learned to move fast when the machine beneath them started to die. They stood in a tight cluster 30 yards down slope, watching their tank the way you watch a dog that's bitten you twice, wary, angry, done with second chances. Private Elwood Malone was 19 years old. He sat on a rock with his head between his knees, hands shaking so badly he couldn't light the cigarette someone had given him. This was the 4th time. The 4th time in 6 weeks that this particular tank had quit on them, and this time it had happened during a German counterattack with 88mm shells walking up the hillside toward them, like the footsteps of something massive and terrible. Corporal Nathaniel Briggs stood above the kid, not looking at him. Briggs was 26 and had the kind of face that hadn't smiled in so long it had forgotten how. He stared at the Sherman with the focused intensity of hatred, pure, distilled, personal hatred. "4th time," he said to no one in particular. His voice was flat, Midwestern, empty of everything except a truth he needed to speak aloud. "4th goddamn time this coffin tried to kill us." Lieutenant Amos Fletcher said nothing. He was 32, had taught mathematics at a high school in Pennsylvania before the war, and understood probability better than most. The probability of the same tank failing 4 times in 6 weeks with 4 different reported problems was statistically interesting. The probability of surviving a 5th failure was not a calculation he wanted to make. He pulled a photograph from his breast pocket. His wife. His daughter. 3 years old in the picture, 5 now. He hadn't seen her since she was 2. The photo was creased down the middle from being folded and unfolded too many times. He looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, then put it away. Private Harlan Kowalski, the driver, sat apart from the others. 21 years old, thin as a fence post, with hands that were always moving, always fidgeting. He had a letter half written in his lap ink, smudged from where sweat had dripped onto the paper. "Dear Mum." It started. That's as far as he'd gotten. He'd been trying to write this letter for 3 days, trying to find words that would tell her he was fine without being a lie that would prepare her without terrifying her. He couldn't find those words, so the letter stayed unfinished. The tank recovery vehicle arrived an hour later, a massive beast with a winch that could drag 30 tons of dead Sherman like it was hauling a child's wagon. The crew didn't help. They just watched as their tank, the machine they lived inside, fought inside, could die inside, was chained and pulled like livestock to slaughter. Briggs walked up to the hull as it was being secured. He made a fist, drew back, hit the armor plate hard enough that his knuckles split. The sound rang out across the desert, a single bell note of frustration. "Either fix it properly," he said, his voice still flat, still empty, "or give us a new one." He hit it again. Blood smeared across the steel. "This thing is trying to kill us." The recovery crew sergeant, a man named Vernon Aldrich, who had seen this scene play out too many times to count, just nodded. His face had that quality of old leather, sun-damaged and cracked. He was 42, too old for this, but the army needed mechanics more than it needed young legs. "We'll see what we can do," Aldrich said. The words came out in the flat voice of someone who has said this too many times, who knows that "we'll see" usually means "probably not." Then he added, "Eli, this one's yours again." No, not Eli. Silas. Silas Macklin stood 20 feet away, half hidden in the shadow of a half-track that had thrown a track 2 days ago. He was 38 years old and looked 50. His hands were black with grease that never fully came off no matter how hard you scrubbed. His coveralls were the kind of stain that spoke of years, not days. Oil. Hydraulic fluid. Blood, probably, though whose blood was anyone's guess. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like what he was, a man who spent too many hours under machines, breathing their exhaust, feeling their heat, listening to their complaints. Other mechanics had a nickname for him. They called him Mad Cy. Not because he shouted, not because he drank, though he did that too sometimes when the day had been particularly bad. They called him mad because he refused to accept the usual answers about what a tank could or could not do. Silas walked toward Sherman 30471, The way a doctor approaches a patient who keeps coming back with the same symptoms. Slow, deliberate, already thinking. He didn't speak to the crew, didn't ask them what happened. Not yet. First, he walked around the tank, all the way around, looking at things that weren't broken, looking at the wear patterns on the tracks. The way the suspension sat, the scorch marks on the paint. He ran his hand along the hull. His fingers traced seams, feeling for heat, for vibration patterns that had been absorbed into the metal. To anyone watching, it looked strange, intimate almost, like he was reading Braille on the surface of the machine. Silas had worked as a civilian mechanic before the war. Detroit, the big plants. He'd maintained industrial equipment presses that could crush a car into a cube conveyor systems that ran 3 shifts without stopping assembly line machinery that couldn't afford to break because every minute of downtime cost someone money. He hadn't gone to engineering school, hadn't studied thermodynamics or materials science. He'd learned by doing, by listening, by developing an instinct for where stress accumulated, where tolerances were too tight, where something that worked fine on paper failed in the real world. His foreman used to say something to him back in '39, back when the world was different. You don't just fix it, Si. You listen to what it's trying to tell you. That was the difference. Most mechanics fixed the symptom. Silas tried to understand the disease. He carried a small notebook, had been carrying it since North Africa, since the campaign that had churned through men and machines like they were equally expendable. The notebook was oil-stained, water-damaged, held together with electrical tape. The pages were filled with sketches, short notes, odd patterns he'd noticed over 2 years of field repairs. He opened it now, flipped past pages of half-track transmissions and Jeep axles, and 3 different attempts to diagnose why certain Shermans threw track on the left side more than the right. Found the page for tank 30471. The serial number was written at the top in smudged pencil, below it a timeline. First repair track problem, October 8th. Fixed, returned to service. Second repair cooling issue, October 23rd. Fixed, returned to service. Third repair, minor engine failure, November 4th. Fixed, returned to service. Fourth repair today. Beside the number 4, he wrote slowly, carefully. Return number 4. Engine plus turret plus heat. Heavy on hill. He underlined the last 3 words twice. Then he walked to the rear of the tank and opened the engine access panels. The M4 Sherman used different engines in different versions. Some had radial aircraft engines. Some had diesel units. Some had multi-bank conversions that were essentially 5 car engines welded together into one unholy amalgamation. This particular Sherman had a Continental R975 radial engine. In theory, it produced 400 horsepower. In theory, it was powerful enough to move 30 tons of steel and armor across any terrain the Army asked it to cross. In practice, it had been built fast and installed faster. Silas looked at the engine for a long time without touching anything. He traced the path of the cables with his eyes, followed the fuel lines, checked the routing of the electrical systems that fed the turret traverse motor. He had seen this kind of engine in other machines. Sometimes it worked well, sometimes it didn't. He noticed 2 things at once. First, the engine mounts looked slightly stressed. The rubber blocks, 4 of them each about the size of a man's fist, were worn unevenly. The front 2 were compressed to maybe 30% of their original thickness. The rear 2 looked almost new. That meant the weight distribution was wrong. That meant the engine was rocking under load, shifting in ways it wasn't supposed to shift. Second, a set of cables feeding the turret systems had been routed in a way that didn't match the diagram he carried in his head. Someone somewhere earlier in this tank's life had saved time by running them along a shorter path. It worked. Mostly. It also meant that when the engine shifted under load, and it would shift because those front mounts were shot, it pulled slightly on those cables. Small detail. But small details matter in machines that weigh 30 tons and carry 5 men who want to see home again. Silas closed the panels, walked over to where the crew sat waiting. "I need to talk to you," he said. His voice was quiet. Not gentle. There was nothing gentle about Silas Macklin, but quiet. The kind of quiet that made men listen, because something in the tone said this mattered. Fletcher stood first. The others followed. Silas didn't begin with wrenches. He began with questions. When it failed, he said to Kowalski, "What did it feel like?" Kowalski blinked. "What did it feel like?" "Not what broke. What you felt. Through the controls. Through the seat." The kid thought about it. "Heavy," he said finally. Like the tank was fighting me. On the hills. It felt heavier than it should.
Silas wrote that down. He turned to Fletcher. How did it behave in rough ground? Sluggish, Fletcher said, especially uphill. And the temperature gauge? He paused, remembering. It would creep up, then drop suddenly, like it couldn't decide if it was overheating or not. Silas wrote that down too. He looked at Briggs. You notice anything strange about vibrations when the gun fired on the move? Briggs stared at him like he'd asked something in a foreign language. Then slowly recognition crossed his face. Yeah, he said. Sometimes, when we traversed the turret while the driver was shifting gears, there'd be this shudder through the floor, like something was catching. Silas nodded, wrote it down. The answers were ordinary. Most mechanics would have picked out one symptom and aimed at it. Overheating. Check the radiator. Shudder. Check the mounts. Sluggish on hills. Clean the fuel filters. Silas did something else. He opened his notebook to an earlier page. September. 2 months ago. Tank serial number 28634. Similar symptoms. Returned to service. 3 days later, catastrophic electrical failure during combat. Turret fire. 4 men burned to death. 1 survived long enough to describe what happened. Said it felt like the tank had turned on them. He turned to another page. October. Tank serial number 31247. Engine mount failure led to cable damage, led to voltage spike, led to ammunition cook-off. 5 men dead. Tank destroyed so completely they couldn't determine which part failed first. 9 men total. 9 men who had climbed into Shermans that looked fine, that had passed inspection, that had been repaired according to the manual. Silas looked at Fletcher. How many times has this tank been repaired? This is the 4th. And each time it came back faster than you expected. Fletcher's face changed. Understanding was dawning, and it was the kind of understanding that made a man's hands cold. Yes, he said quietly. Silas closed the notebook. It's going to come back a 5th time, he said. And a 6th. And eventually it's going to fail during combat, and you're going to bail out or you're not. And either way another crew gets this tank and the cycle starts again. Why? That was Malone, the kid, his voice cracking. Why does it keep breaking? Because it's not breaking, Silas said. It's being broken. By the way it was built. By shortcuts someone took in a factory last summer to meet production quotas. By a system that repairs symptoms instead of causes. He looked at Aldrich, who had been standing close enough to hear all of this. I need to really fix this, Silas said. Not patch it. Fix it. Aldrich knew what that meant. It meant hours instead of minutes. It meant work that wasn't in the manual. It meant modifications that some officer somewhere might decide were unauthorized, might decide warranted discipline. But Aldrich was 42 years old and had a son in the Pacific and knew exactly what it felt like to lie awake at night, wondering if the people keeping the machines running were doing it right or doing it fast. He looked at Malone, 19 years old, shaking. He thought about his son. How long? Aldrich asked. 8 hours, Silas said. Maybe 10. You've got 8. And Si, if it breaks worse, it's on you. Silas didn't answer. He just walked back to the tank. The sun was setting. The North African desert turned the color of rust and old blood. Shadows grew long. The temperature dropped fast, it always did out here. You could cook during the day and freeze at night, and men learned to adapt, or they died. Silas opened the engine compartment panels and propped them with a piece of metal rod. Set up a work light, just a bulb on a wire powered by a generator that coughed and rattled in the background. The light cast harsh shadows, made the engine bay look like the inside of something's ribcage. He pulled out his tools. Not many. A set of wrenches, screwdrivers, wire cutters, a small hammer. Everything was old, worn, stained, but everything worked. That was the important part. Before he touched anything, he did something strange. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a photograph. A little girl. 7 years old in the picture. Blonde hair, gap-toothed smile. She was standing next to a car, an old Ford, beaten-up hood open. In the picture she was holding a wrench almost as big as her arm, grinning at the camera, like she'd just discovered something wonderful. Her name was Ruth. She had drawn pictures for him. Crayon drawings on paper that came in letters from home, forwarded through military mail, arriving weeks late, smudged and wrinkled. The last one showed a stick-figure man with a wrench. Above it, in a child's uneven printing, Daddy fixes things. He looked at that photograph for maybe 5 seconds. Then he put it back in his pocket. All right, he said to the tank, to the machine, to the problem. Let's see what you're really trying to tell me. He began with the engine mounts. removed them one at a time. The front two came off easily. They were so compressed they'd lost almost all their spring. The rubber was cracked, heat-damaged, older than they should have been. He set them aside. The rear two were newer, less wear. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Uneven wear meant uneven load distribution, meant the engine was tilting forward under acceleration, shifting its weight onto mounts that couldn't take it, pulling on systems that weren't designed to flex. He needed new mounts. All four. Matching set. The salvage yard was 50 yards away. Wrecked tanks that would never move again, cannibalized for parts, slowly being torn apart to keep other machines alive. Silas walked through it with his work light, checking serial numbers, looking for Shermans with the same engine configuration. Found one. The tank had taken an 88 through the turret. The crew was gone. The turret was gone. But the engine bay was intact. He removed the mounts. All four. Tested each one by hand, squeezing them, checking for cracks. 3 were good. 1 was marginal. But marginal was better than what he had. He carried them back. The work was methodical, mechanical. The kind of work that lets a man's hands move while his mind does something else. He installed the new mounts, torqued them down, checked alignment with a straight edge and a prayer. Then came the cables. This was the part that would get him in trouble if anyone looked too closely. This was the part that wasn't in any manual. He traced every electrical line that ran from the engine compartment to the turret. There were 6. 6 cables carrying 24-volt current to the traverse motor, to the elevation controls, to the firing systems. 6 cables that some factory worker had routed along the shortest path to save maybe 3 minutes of installation time. Silas mapped them, drew the current routing in his notebook, then drew what the routing should be. More slack. That was the key. Cables needed room to flex when the engine moved, needed to be secured away from heat sources, needed to follow paths that didn't create stress points. He spent an hour rerouting, pulled the cables free carefully because they were old and the insulation was brittle, ran them through different brackets, added standoffs made from pieces of rubber hose to keep them from vibrating against metal, created loops of extra length so that when the engine shifted under load, the cables could give instead of pull. It was delicate work. His hands were too big for some of it. His fingers were scarred and calloused and not meant for precision. But he managed. Then the brace. He'd noticed that one section of the engine bay flexed too much. The frame rails weren't quite stiff enough. Under load, under combat conditions, that flex translated into movement that stressed everything mounted to it. He needed a brace, triangular, custom-made. He found a piece of scrap metal in the salvage yard, 1/4-inch steel plate. He cut it with a hacksaw, working by the light of the moon now because his work light had died. Cut it into an L shape, 40 degrees approximately. He didn't have a protractor. He judged it by eye. Then he had to weld it. The welding rig was ancient, probably older than he was. The arc sputtered and spat, and the light was so bright it burned after-images into his vision. But the weld held. He ground it smooth, fitted the brace into place. It sat between 2 frame points, adding rigidity, preventing the flex that had been there before. Small modification. Wouldn't show up on any inspection. Might not even be noticed. But it would matter. It would distribute stress differently. It would make the machine behave more like it was supposed to behave and less like it was trying to shake itself apart. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. The desert was cold. His breath came out in clouds. His hands were numb. He closed the panels, secured them, stepped back. The tank looked the same, exactly the same. No one would know that anything had changed. But Silas knew. He pulled out his notebook one more time, drew careful sketches of what he'd done, the cable routing, the brace placement, the mount positions, added notes in the margins about torque specifications and clearances and the reasons behind each choice. Then he made a copy. Carbon paper. The copy was smudged and barely legible, but it was enough. He folded the copy, put it in his pocket. The original page stayed in the notebook. He looked at tank 30471 one more time. 30 tons of steel in the moonlight. Silent. Waiting. "You're not going to kill them," he said quietly. "Not if I can help it." Then he walked away to find a place to sleep for 3 hours before the sun came up and the work started again. Dawn came like a hammer. The sun rose over the Tunisian desert with that particular quality of light that makes everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Silas Macklin woke on the ground beside a half-track, his back screaming, his hands still black with grease from the night before. He was 38 years old and felt every single year of it. He sat up slowly, looked across the repair yard to where Sherman 30471 sat waiting. In the early light it looked almost peaceful, almost innocent. The crew arrived an hour later.
They came as a group the way men do when they're nervous about something. Fletcher in front, the officer trying to look confident. Kowalski and Malone trailing behind. Briggs, walking alone to the side, his face still carrying that same flat expression of controlled hatred. Silas was already there, standing beside the tank, notebook in hand. "It's done," he said. No preamble, no explanation. Just those two words. Fletcher looked at the Sherman, looked at Silas. "What did you do?" "Fixed it," Silas said. Then, because that wasn't enough, he added, "Changed the mounts, all four, rerouted the electrical cables, added a brace to reduce frame flex." Briggs stepped forward. "That in the manual?" "No." "So you modified it?" "I fixed it," Silas repeated. His voice stayed level, calm. "The manual tells you how to replace parts that break. It doesn't tell you how to fix why they break." There was a long silence. Kowalski shifted his weight from foot to foot, nervous energy with nowhere to go. Malone looked like he might be sick. "We need to test it," Fletcher said finally. Silas nodded. "Hill 7. Full combat load. Traverse the turret while you're climbing. Try to make it fail. And if it does fail," that was Briggs, his voice sharp, "then you bail out," Silas said quietly. "Same as you would have anyway, but it won't fail. Not the same way, not for the same reasons." Fletcher made a decision. You could see it happen on his face that moment when a man decides to trust something he doesn't fully understand because the alternative is worse. "Mount up," he said to his crew. They climbed into the tank, slow, reluctant, like men climbing into a coffin they'd already escaped from 4 times before. The engine started on the second try. The sound was different, smoother, less of that rattling cough that had become familiar. Kowalski sat in the driver's seat, hands on the controls, listening with his whole body the way drivers do. "It feels," he started, then stopped, shook his head. "Different." The Sherman rolled forward, slow at first, then building speed. It crossed the flat ground of the repair yard tracks, throwing up dust engine notes, steady and strong. Hill 7 was a mile away. Not much of a hill by most standards, maybe 150 feet of elevation gain over a quarter-mile of broken ground. Rocky, uneven. The kind of terrain that stressed every system in a tank, that found every weakness, every design flaw, every shortcut someone had taken to save money or time. This was where 30471 had failed 3 times out of 4. The crew knew it. You could feel the tension even from a distance. Silas stood watching Sergeant Aldrich beside him, both men silent. The Sherman hit the base of the hill and began to climb. The engine sound changed, deeper, working harder. That was normal. Expected. 30 tons going uphill, the engine had to work. But it didn't cough, didn't stutter, didn't develop that high whine that meant something was pulling wrong. Something was under stress it couldn't handle. Halfway up, Fletcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Traversing turret!" The turret began to rotate. Slow, steady. The electric motor humming, drawing current, putting load on systems that had failed before. The tank kept climbing. Silas didn't realize he'd been holding his breath until his lungs started to burn. He let it out slowly. "Come on," Aldrich muttered beside him. "Come on, you bastard." The Sherman reached the crest of Hill 7. Stopped. The turret completed a full 360 rotation. Then another. The engine idled, temperature climbing, but staying within normal range. No smoke, no steam, no sudden silence that meant something had given up. Fletcher's voice on the radio. "Taking it back down. Hard acceleration." The descent was almost worse than the climb. Gravity and momentum fighting the brakes, the transmission, every mechanical system trying to slow 30 tons that wanted to just keep falling. This was where cooling systems failed, where brakes burned out, where catastrophic failures happened fast. The Sherman came down steady, controlled, reached the bottom and circled back toward the repair yard. When it pulled up in front of Silas, the crew sat inside for a long moment. Nobody moved. Then, one by one, they climbed out. Kowalski's hands were shaking, not from fear this time, from something else. Relief, maybe, or the shock of survival when you'd expected to die. "It didn't fail," he said. His voice cracked on the last word. "It didn't." He couldn't finish. Just stood there, 21 years old, trying not to cry. Fletcher looked at Silas, the mathematics teacher from Pennsylvania who understood probability, who had calculated the odds of this tank killing them and decided those odds were unacceptable. "What did you really do?" he asked. Silas thought about how to answer that. Thought about cable routing and voltage spikes and cascade failures. Thought about trying to explain engineering to someone whose expertise was teaching algebra to teenagers. "I listened,"
he said finally. The tank was trying to tell us what was wrong. We just weren't hearing it right. Briggs walked up to the Sherman, put his hand on the hull, not hitting it this time, just touching it, the way you might touch something you'd misjudged. You fixed it, he said. Not a question. A statement of fact. For now, Silas said. For this. But, he stopped, looked past them at the repair yard, at the rows of tanks waiting, at the machines that would go back to the front, that would carry men into combat, that would fail or wouldn't fail, based on choices made by people who would never see the consequences. But what? Fletcher asked. Silas pulled out his notebook, opened it to the page he'd been dreading. It's not just your tank, he said quietly. He showed them the list. 8 serial numbers, all Shermans, all with the same engine variant, the same production time frame. Summer of 1943, when the factories were running 3 shifts, when production quotas mattered more than quality control, when shortcuts were encouraged if they saved time. I've checked them, Silas said. Quick inspections. 5 of the 8 show the same symptoms. Early stage. Not critical yet, but they will be. How long? That was Fletcher always asking the right questions. Depends. Combat intensity, terrain luck. Could be weeks, could be days. Can you fix them? Malone asked. The kid was looking at Silas like he was something more than a mechanic, like he was someone who could make the war a little less likely to kill you through mechanical failure. I can, Silas said. But you'd need authorization, Aldrich cut in. He'd been quiet up to now, listening, calculating. To modify 9 tanks outside of standard procedure, I'd need approval from Captain Quinn. The name hung in the air like a weight. Captain Thaddeus Quinn, maintenance officer, 41 years old, West Point class of 24 career Army. A man who lived by regulations because regulations were the only thing keeping chaos at bay in a war that generated chaos like an engine generated heat. He'll say no, Briggs said flatly. Maybe, Aldrich said. Maybe not, but it has to go through him. Silas closed his notebook. Then we talked to him. The meeting happened 3 hours later in a tent that served as Quinn's office. The tent was neat, organized. A desk made from ammunition crates, a filing system that actually worked, maps on the wall with pins marking unit positions, supply lines, maintenance schedules. Quinn sat behind the desk. He was tall, thin, with the kind of posture that came from years of military discipline. His uniform was clean despite the desert pressed, despite the heat. His eyes were grey and measured everything. Aldrich stood at attention. Silas stood beside him, not at attention, because he was a corporal, and corporal mechanics didn't rate the full parade ground treatment. Explain, Quinn said. Aldrich did. Kept it brief. Tank 30471, 4 failures pattern identified, unauthorized modification, successful test run. Then the bigger problem, 8 more tanks with the same defect. Quinn listened without interrupting. His face showed nothing. When Aldrich finished, he turned to Silas. You modified a combat vehicle without authorization. Yes, sir, Silas said. That's a court-martial offense. Yes, sir. Why did you do it? Silas met his eyes. Because 5 men would have died if I didn't. Quinn picked up a pencil, tapped it against the desk. 3 taps. Precise. That's speculation. You don't know they would have died. I know 2 other tanks with the same defect did die, sir. 9 men. I reported it in September and October. The reports went up the chain. Nothing came back. Something changed in Quinn's expression. Not much. Just a small tightening around the eyes. Show me, he said. Silas opened his notebook, found the pages. Tank 28634, Tank 31247, dates, symptoms, failure modes, the names of the men who died written in small, careful letters because Silas believed that names mattered, that counting the dead without naming them was a kind of cowardice. Quinn read it all, took his time. When he looked up, his face was different, still controlled, still professional, but something human had entered the equation. This is detailed documentation, he said. Yes, sir. You've been tracking this for months. Yes, sir. And no one responded to your reports? No, sir. Quinn set down the notebook, looked at Aldrich. Your mechanic is accusing the United States Army of negligent homicide. With respect, sir, Aldrich said carefully, he's accusing the system of being overwhelmed. Too many tanks. Too many problems. Too few people paying attention to patterns. Quinn stood, walked to the map on the wall, stared at it for a long moment. If you're right, he said, still looking at the map, and this defect is systemic to a production batch, then it's bigger than my authority. It should go to division, maybe higher. Yes, sir, Silas said. But that takes time. Weeks, probably. Forms and inspections and verification. Meanwhile, those 8 tanks go back to combat. Quinn turned. What are you proposing? Let me fix them, Silas said. The same way I fixed 30471. Document everything. If it works, you have proof, real proof, combat tested. Then it goes up the chain with data, not just reports. And if it doesn't work, if you make it worse, then you court-martial me, Silas said simply. But the tanks aren't any worse off than they are now. Quinn looked at him for a long time, measuring, calculating.
This was a man who had made a career out of following rules, out of understanding that rules existed for reasons that chaos happened when everyone decided they knew better than the system. But Quinn was also a man who had read casualty reports, who knew what it meant when a tank burned, when a crew couldn't get out, when men died not because the enemy was better, but because something that should have worked didn't. "One tank," he said finally. "You've proven it works with one tank in one test. That's not enough." Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. "Sir, I need you to prove it works in combat," Quinn continued. "Real combat, not a test run up a hill. Tank 30471 goes back to the front. The next engagement it survives without mechanical failure, we'll talk about the others." It was the best offer Silas was going to get. He knew it, hated it, accepted it. "Yes, sir," he said. Fletcher and his crew got the news an hour later. They'd been waiting outside the tent, trying not to look like they were listening, failing. "We're bait," Briggs said when Fletcher told them. His voice was flat. "Guinea pigs, lab rats in a 30-ton tin can." "We're proof," Fletcher corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Briggs looked at the lieutenant. "We survive, great. We get blown up also great, because at least then they'll know the damn tank works. That's backwards logic." "That's the army," Kowalski said quietly. They stood in silence. 4 men and a kid, all thinking the same thing, that they'd already escaped this tank 4 times. That probability was not on their side, that asking them to go back in and trust it felt like asking them to trust a loaded gun pressed against their own heads. Malone spoke up, his voice small. "I want to write a letter home, a real one, just in case." "No," Fletcher said. The word came out harder than he meant. He softened his tone. "No." "You write that letter, you're accepting that we're not coming back. I'm not accepting that. But the mechanic fixed it. We tested it. It worked." Fletcher looked at each of them. "I know it's hard. I know we've been burned before, but that was before. This is after. We trust the machine or we don't. I'm choosing to trust it." "Easy for you to say," Briggs muttered. "No," Fletcher said quietly. "It's not. I have a wife, a daughter. I promised I'd come home. Every time I climb into that tank, I'm betting my promise against German guns and mechanical failures and pure dumb luck. This time, at least the mechanical failure part is better. That's not nothing." They went back to their tents. Tried to sleep. Failed, mostly. Kowalski did write his letter. Finished it this time. Told his mother he was fine. Told her the food was good and the weather was nice and he'd made friends. Didn't tell her about the tank that kept trying to kill them. Didn't tell her about being 19 years old and terrified every single day. Sealed the envelope, addressed it, put it in his pocket instead of mailing it, just in case. Silas worked through the night again. Not on 30471, that was done. On documentation. He copied his notebook pages, made sketches of the cable routing, the brace placement, the mount configuration. Drew diagrams that someone else could follow. Someone else could replicate. He made 3 copies. Carbon paper. The copies were smudged, barely legible in places, but they were enough. He gave one to Aldrich. "If something happens to me," he said. Aldrich took it without comment. Understood what something meant. Filed it away in a place where it might survive even if Silas didn't. The second copy went to Private Roscoe Pruitt. Young mechanic, maybe 23, eager to learn, not yet beaten down by the weight of keeping machines running in a war that destroyed them faster than factories could build them. "Read it," Silas told him. "Learn it. If we get authorization for the other tanks, you'll help." Pruitt looked at the pages like they were something precious, something holy. "You really think this'll work? Fixing them all?" "I think it has to work," Silas said, "because the alternative is more crews burning." The third copy stayed in Silas's notebook. He sat alone in the dark, his work light dead again, just the moon and stars overhead. Pulled out the photograph of Ruth. 7 years old, gap-toothed smile. Daddy fixes things. "I'm trying, sweetheart," he said to the photograph. To the daughter who was 5,000 miles away and might as well have been on another planet. "I'm really trying." He thought about what Fletcher had said, about betting promises against war.
about coming home. Silas had made the same promise. Standing in his driveway in Detroit, Ruth crying, holding onto his leg. "I'll come back," he'd told her. "Daddy always comes back." She'd believed him. Kids believed everything their fathers told them. He folded the photograph carefully, put it back in his pocket, looked across the repair yard to where Sherman 30471 sat in the moonlight. Fixed now, better than it had been, but still just a machine, still vulnerable, still capable of failing in 1,000 different ways that had nothing to do with cable routing or engine mounts. Tomorrow, it would go back to combat. Tomorrow, Fletcher and his crew would climb inside and drive toward whatever the war put in front of them. And if it worked, if the tank held, if the system stayed stable, if men came back alive, then maybe Silas could fix the others. Maybe he could save more than just 5 men. Maybe his promise to Ruth would be a promise he could keep. "Come on," he said to the tank, to the machine, to the war itself. "Just work, just this once, just long enough." The desert wind blew cold. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent. And somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like thunder that never quite arrived. Dawn would come soon, and with it, the test that mattered, the only test that counted. Survival. December 1943. The Italian mountains. Winter came to the Mediterranean like a knife. Cold rain that turned to sleet, then snow. Mud that could swallow a truck to its axles. Mountains that rose sharp and unforgiving where every road was a nightmare and every hill was a fortress. This was where Sherman 30471 went to prove itself. The crew had been rotated to Italy after Tunisia fell. New theatre, new terrain, same war. They'd had 3 weeks of relative quiet patrol duty, supply, escort, the kind of work that let a man almost forget what combat felt like. Almost. The mission briefing came on a morning when frost covered everything. Lieutenant Fletcher stood with his crew outside the tank breath, coming out in clouds, listening to a captain he'd never met explain what they were about to do.
"Advance through the valley," the captain said, pointing at a map. "Support infantry assault on German positions on the ridgeline. Armor support suppression fire, standard doctrine." Standard doctrine. The words that meant nothing and everything. "Terrain," Fletcher asked. "Difficult, steep grades, narrow roads, good defensive positions for anti-tank guns." Briggs made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "So, suicide." The captain looked at him. "Do you have a problem, Corporal?" "No, sir," Briggs said. "Just clarifying the mission parameters." They mounted up an hour later. 5 men climbing into 30 tons of steel. The routine was so familiar now it happened without thought. Kowalski in the driver's seat, hands on controls that he knew better than he knew his own face. Malone loading shells, his movements efficient now, no longer the terrified kid from Tunisia. Briggs at the gun, settling into the seat, like putting on an old coat. Fletcher in the commander's position, head and shoulders out of the hatch, scanning terrain through binoculars. And the tank itself, modified, fixed. Silas's invisible hands in every cable routing, every mount, every brace. The engine started on the first try. That smooth sound. No rattle, no cough. Kowalski's voice over the intercom. "She sounds good." "She'd better," Briggs muttered. The column moved out. 6 Shermans, infantry following in half-tracks. The road, if you could call it a road, wound up through the valley like a snake. Narrow, muddy. Trees on both sides, their branches heavy with ice. This was ambush country. Everyone knew it. You could feel it in the way men held their weapons, in the silence that settled over the column, in the constant scanning of tree lines and ridge tops. 2 miles in the road began to climb. 15-degree grade, then 20, then steeper. Kowalski felt the tank's response through the controls, felt the engine working, the transmission gearing down the tracks, biting into mud and rock. Felt for that familiar heaviness, that sense of the machine fighting itself. It wasn't there. "Climbing steady," he reported. His voice carried surprise even through the intercom crackle. Fletcher heard it, recognized it. The surprise of something working when you'd grown accustomed to failure. They reached a switchback. Tight turn, steep grade, the kind of maneuver that stressed every system. Kowalski took it slow. The tank's weight shifted. The engine note changed but stayed strong. No smoke, no overheat, no sudden loss of power. "Still good," Kowalski said. They climbed for 20 minutes. The grade never let up. This was exactly the terrain where 30471 had failed before. Steep hills, heavy load, systems under maximum stress. The tank kept climbing. Fletcher allowed himself a small moment of hope. Dangerous thing, hope. It made you careless. Made you think survival was more than just probability and luck. But he felt it anyway. Then the Germans opened fire.
The sound came first, that distinctive crack of an 88mm gun. High velocity, flat trajectory. The sound arrives at the same time as the shell because nothing moves faster than sound except the thing trying to kill you. The round hit the hillside 20 yards to the left. Rock and dirt erupted. Shrapnel pinged off armor. "Contact left," Fletcher shouted. "Traverse left enemy anti-tank position." This was the moment, the test that mattered. The turret began to rotate, electric motor humming, drawing current through cables that had been rerouted through systems that had been modified by a mechanic who refused to accept that good enough was acceptable. The turret traversed smooth, no shudder, no vibration through the floor. Briggs acquired the target. Flash of muzzle fire from a tree line 200 yards upslope. German gun crew dug in waiting. "Target acquired," Briggs said. His voice was ice. "Firing!" The 75mm gun roared. Recoil rocked the tank. The shell traced fire through cold air and impacted exactly where Briggs had aimed. The German position disappeared in smoke and flame. "Hit," Briggs confirmed. But there was more than one gun. There was never just one gun. Another 88 opened up from higher on the ridge. Then another. The Germans had prepared this position, had known the Americans would come this way, had turned the valley into a killing ground. Shells walked toward the column. One Sherman took a direct hit. Turret armor penetrated. The tank stopped moving. Smoke poured from hatches. Men bailed out, some running, some not moving at all. "All tanks disperse." The radio crackled with orders. "Take cover. Return fire." Fletcher. "Driver, position us behind that rock outcrop. Gunner, target the upper gun position." The tank moved. Kowalski threw it into a hard turn, tracks screaming, engine roaring. They slewed sideways into cover behind a formation of boulders. Here was the real test. Not a climb up a test hill. Not a controlled environment. This was combat. Chaos. Systems under stress that no factory had ever anticipated, no engineer had ever calculated. The turret traversed again. Right this time. Fast. The electric motor pulling current, the cables flexing as the tank rocked on uneven ground, the engine running hot but not overheating. Everything Silas had fixed was being tested simultaneously. Every cable, every mount, every brace point. "Target acquired," Briggs said. "Firing!" Another roar, another hit. The second German gun went silent. "Driver, advance to next cover. Stay in defilade." The tank moved again. Climbing, always climbing. The engine sound never wavering, never developing that high whine that meant something was pulling wrong. Kowalski couldn't believe it. 20 minutes of combat, hard maneuvering, turret traversing constantly. The tank was performing like it was supposed to perform, like it had never performed before. "She's holding," he said over the intercom. Not a report, just amazement. The battle lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes of moving and shooting and taking cover. 40 minutes of German shells walking across the hillside of American tanks, firing back of infantry advancing through hell because that's what infantry did. Sherman 30471 engaged 7 targets, destroyed 4 confirmed, traversed the turret 32 times, climbed 300 vertical feet of mountain terrain, and never failed. Not once. Not in any of the ways it had failed before. When the German positions finally went silent, when the order came to hold position and wait for engineers to clear the road ahead, Fletcher sat in the commander's position with his hand on the turret ring and tried to process what had just happened. They'd survived, not through luck, not through miracle, through engineering, through a mechanic who had seen a pattern and refused to accept that men should die because of factory shortcuts. "Dismount," Fletcher ordered. 5-minute break. They climbed out, stood beside the tank. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The Sherman was damaged, paint scorched from near misses, track pins sheared from the violent maneuvering, a dent in the hull where shrapnel had hit. But it was running, systems intact, ready to fight again. Briggs walked up to the hull, put both hands on the armor, pressed his forehead against the cold steel. "You tried to kill us," he said quietly, "but only with the enemy this time." It wasn't a joke. It was recognition, acknowledgement. The tank had done its job, had protected them, had been what it was supposed to be. Malone sat on the ground back against a rock, 19 years old, hands shaking, but alive. Kowalski pulled out the letter he'd written to his mother, the one he'd kept in his pocket just in case. He looked at it for a long moment, then tore it in half, then in half again. Let the pieces scatter in the mountain wind. He'd write a new letter tonight, one without lies, one that said he might actually make it home. Fletcher watched his crew, watched the machine that had carried them through hell, made a decision. "I'm putting this in my report," he said. "All of it. The modifications, the mechanic who did them, the fact that we just survived an engagement that should have killed us because someone refused to follow the manual. Quinn won't like that, Briggs said. Quinn asked for combat proof, Fletcher replied. He's got it now. The report went up the chain 3 days later. Typed on a field typewriter, carbon copies made official letterhead. Lieutenant Amos Fletcher, commanding Sherman 30471, submitting after-action report with special notation regarding mechanical performance under combat conditions. The report was specific. Times, coordinates, number of engagements, terrain conditions, temperature readings, everything quantified, everything documented, because Fletcher had been a mathematics teacher and understood that data mattered more than opinion. The report reached Captain Quinn's desk, along with 6 others from that day's action. He read them in order. Professional, methodical, looking for patterns, for problems, for things that needed attention. When he reached Fletcher's report, he stopped, read it twice, then a third time. Then he called for Sergeant Aldrich. Your mechanic was right, Quinn said without preamble. Aldrich stood at attention, said nothing. Tank 30471 performed flawlessly under combat conditions that should have caused multiple system failures based on its previous history. Quinn tapped the report. The modifications worked. Yes, sir. Quinn looked at him, grey eyes measuring. How many other tanks have the same defect? 8 confirmed, sir. Possibly more in other units.
Can your man fix them, all of them?
Yes, sir, with help. He's already trained Pruitt on the procedures. I've got 2 other mechanics who can learn. Quinn stood, walked to his map, stared at it the way he'd stared at it during the first meeting, making calculations, measuring risks against rewards. No official authorization, he said finally. No paperwork, no records. This doesn't exist. Sir, if I authorize this officially, it goes through channels, takes weeks, forms and inspections and committees. Meanwhile, those tanks go to combat with defects we know about. He turned. I'm not doing that. I'm not sending men to die because paperwork is more important than lives. What are you ordering, sir? I'm not ordering anything, Quinn said. I'm looking the other way. Your mechanic fixes those tanks. He documents everything. If it works, if those tanks perform better, then in 6 months or a year, when someone asks why our mechanical failure rate is lower than other units, we have proof. Real data, combat tested. At that point, it goes official. It becomes doctrine. Aldrich understood. This was command. This was what leadership looked like when you were caught between regulations and reality. Yes, sir, he said. And Sergeant... Quinn's voice softened slightly. Tell your mechanic thank you. From me. Off the record. That man saved lives today. He'll probably save more. He won't get a medal. His name won't appear in any citation. But he should know that someone noticed. I'll tell him, sir. The work began that night. Silas and 3 other mechanics, Pruitt, a corporal named Davidson, and a private named Webb, working by lamplight in the repair yard. 8 Sherman tanks with the same defect, same production batch, same factory shortcuts. They approached it systematically, 1 tank at a time. Silas walking them through each step, showing them what to look for, how to route the cables, where to place the braces. It's not about following instructions, he told them. It's about understanding why. Why do the cables need slack? Because the engine moves under load. Why does the brace go at this angle? Because that's where the stress concentrates. Understand the why, and you can adapt when conditions change. They learned. Slowly at first, then faster. By the 3rd tank, Pruitt could do most of the work himself with Silas supervising. By the 5th tank, Davidson had modified his own technique, found a slightly better way to secure the cable runs. That's good, Silas told him. That's better than what I did. Use it. It took 2 weeks to modify all 8 tanks. 2 weeks of night shifts and cold hands and work that nobody would ever officially acknowledge. But word spread anyway, the way word always spreads in an army, crew to crew, sergeant to sergeant. Men in tents at night sharing stories, talking about the mechanic who fixed the unfixable. Other crews started requesting Silas's section for repairs, started asking if their tanks could get the treatment. Not understanding exactly what that meant, just knowing that tanks that went through Silas's hands came back more reliable. The failure rate dropped, not dramatically, not in ways that would show up on a monthly report, but enough that mechanics noticed, enough that maintenance officers started asking questions, and the kills mounted. Tank 30471 and the 8 others modified. Through December, through January, through the slow, grinding advance up the Italian peninsula, where every mile cost blood and every village was a fortress. 11 tanks, modified by a mechanic who refused to accept that factory shortcuts were acceptable.
Who understood that machines didn't know they were supposed to fail? That reliability was a choice, that engineering was about solving problems instead of accepting them. By March 1944, 9 of those 11 tanks were still operational, still fighting, still carrying crews who would otherwise be dead. The statistical analysis would come later. Some officer in a rear echelon headquarters would run the numbers, would notice that Sherman tanks with summer 1943 production markers had a 61% mechanical failure rate in the Italian theatre, but that one particular maintenance unit had only a 40% rate. The investigation would be quiet, professional. They'd interview mechanics, examine procedures, request documentation, and they'd find Silas's notebook, the carbon copies, the sketches and diagrams and careful notes about cable routing and stress points and the reasons behind each modification.
They'd find that someone had solved a problem that had killed 9 men, had created a procedure that could be replicated, had turned field experience into doctrine. The procedure would be absorbed into the official maintenance manual sometime in 1945. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a quiet update to Section 7, Paragraph 4, Field Modification, Mounting Procedure, Revision, Electrical Routing, Optimization. No attribution, no name attached. Just the knowledge, the solution, the fix. Silas Macklin would never know about that. He'd be back in Detroit by then, working on trucks and tractors, living the quiet life he'd promised Ruth. But that came later. In March 1944, Silas was still in Italy, still keeping machines running, still listening to what they were trying to tell him. He sat alone one night, his notebook open, writing by lamplight, adding another entry, another pattern noticed, another problem that had a solution if someone just paid attention. He pulled out the photograph of Ruth. She was 9 now, though he still carried the picture where she was 7. Gap-toothed smile. Daddy fixes things. "I am, sweetheart," he said to the photograph. "One tank at a time. I really am." Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The war continuing, the machinery of violence grinding forward. But here in this repair yard, in this small corner of chaos, one man was making machines more reliable, making survival more probable, making it possible for other fathers to go home to their daughters. He closed the notebook, put away the photograph, looked across the yard at the tanks waiting for attention. Tomorrow there would be more work, more problems, more machines that needed fixing. Tomorrow he would listen, diagnose, solve. Tomorrow he would do what he'd always done, what he'd promised to do, fix things, make them better, keep men alive, not for glory, not for recognition. Just because it was what needed doing, and he was someone who knew how to do it. The lamp flickered. The wind blew cold. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering, unconcerned with whether machines worked or failed. But Silas Macklin cared. And sometimes in the machinery of war, one person caring is enough to change the equation, enough to save lives, enough to turn factory shortcuts into field solutions, enough to build a legend that would never carry his name, but would live on anyway in every tank that ran smoother, in every cable that had enough slack, in every brace that prevented the flex that led to failure. A ghost in the machine, invisible but essential. Silas Macklin, 38-years-old mechanic from Detroit, who refused to accept that good enough was acceptable when better was possible, who fixed things, and in fixing them, fixed something larger, something that mattered more than any single machine. He fixed the gap between design and reality, between theory and practice, between what people said was possible and what actually worked in the mud and chaos of war. He fixed the Sherman, not completely, not perfectly, but enough. And enough sometimes is everything. The lamp went out. Darkness settled over the repair yard. And in that darkness, 11 Sherman tanks sat waiting for dawn, waiting to carry their crews into another day of war. Tanks that would not fail. Not the same way, not for the same reasons. Tanks that had been touched by hands that understood not just how to replace parts, but how to make machines remember what they were supposed to be. Reliable, survivable, good enough to bring men home, good enough to keep promises made to daughters who believed their fathers would return, good enough to matter. And in the end, that was the only metric that counted, not medals or commendations or official recognition. Just this. Did the work matter? Did it save lives? Did it make the war even slightly less likely to kill someone? Yes, it did. It mattered. And Silas Macklin, who would never receive credit, who would never appear in history books, who would die decades later as just another veteran who didn't talk about the war, he knew it mattered. He'd felt it in the grateful handshakes of crews who survived when they shouldn't have.
He'd seen it in the tanks that came back from combat damaged but functional. He'd heard it in the sound of engines that ran smooth when they should have failed. That was enough. That had to be enough. Because in the end, war doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't reward effort. It only measures results. And the result was this: 47 men came home who shouldn't have. 47 fathers and sons and brothers and husbands who survived because one mechanic refused to accept fragility as destiny. 47 lives that continued. That built families.
That added to the sum of human experience in ways large and small. That was Silas Macklin's legacy. Not fame, not glory, just life. Continuing. Because machines worked when they needed to. And sometimes that's what heroism looks like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just competent, just caring enough to do the work right instead of fast, just listening to what the machine is trying to tell you and having the skill and courage to fix what you hear. That's the ghost in the Sherman. That's the legend that lived in metal and cables and carefully placed braces. That's the story of one man who made a difference in a war where individual differences were supposed to be impossible. Silas Macklin. Mechanic, father, problem solver, the man who fixed things, and in fixing them saved lives that history would never count. But the lives counted anyway, to the men who lived them, to the families who welcomed them home, to the children who grew up with fathers instead of gold star flags. They counted, and that in the end was all that mattered.